This is GARIS Masculist MGTOW flyers, that is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 428, entitled Will UBI, that's Universal Basic Income, kill masculism? Description. This flyer speculates on how the near future rise of the UBI, Universal Basic Income, will impact on masculism. Will it kill off masculism when women are made FIPs, that's FIP, financially independent persons, by governments with substantial UBI payments? Certainly, some of the wind will be blown out of the sails of the masculists, since most of today's masculist energy is directed against female manslavery, against female financial parasitism. But monoconscious feminists will probably still feel they have the right to nag men, etc. So masculist ideas will still be needed to force women to grow up, to take responsibility for their own lives, and stop blaming men for female inadequacies and inferiorities. Now the flyer itself, a bit bigger. Will UBI, that's Universal Basic Income, kill masculism? By Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Sometimes I like to play devil's advocate with myself, trying to find counter-arguments to my pet hypotheses. A while back, I was reading one of my several books on the theme of the UBI, Universal Basic Income. That is, money handed out free by the government to every citizen, a bit like unemployment benefit, but not just for the unemployed, but for everyone, no matter what their income, and had an idea, a question. Before launching into my bit of devil's advocacy, I need to say a bit about the motivation behind the need, or the future necessity, of the UBI. Since I'm a retired artificial intelligence professor, in brackets, my specialty was artificial brains, a field I largely pioneered. I like to think about the impact that advanced AI will have on humanity. Stated briefly, I see the need for the government to create a UBI as inevitable, because the machines will continue to advance in their level of, in brackets, artificial intelligence, so that for a human being to be employable, he/she will need to be more intelligent than the machines. But since artificial IQ keeps rising year by year, decade by decade, the threshold IQ needed for a human being to remain employable will also rise, resulting in an ever-growing proportion of humanity whose IQs are lower than that of the machines, who become unemployable due to the simple fact that these human beings are too dumb. If the government does not give them an unemployment benefit, then this ever-growing proportion of the population will not tolerate being left to starve and will vote out of power what they see to be a government that is too callous to remain in power. And in the limit, if that doesn't work, they will simply pick up arms and go to war against the government, since the top priority of anyone is to survive, and starvation is a war issue. Thus, UBI I see as inevitable. Now, since I'm also a masculist theorist, dreaming up theories and ideas that are applicable to men's lib, I had the thought, the question, quote, is it possible that the near future rise of the UBI will effectively kill off masculism, making it largely irrelevant? ? End quote. You may ask, quote, what is the point of the question? Why would a UBI be any threat to the core ideas of masculism? ? End quote. To answer this question, one needs to consider just what the core ideas of masculism are. I've stated in many earlier flyers/videos that the essence of masculism is that it is a rebellion by men against being man-slaves to women, against working for women. Now that women have half a century of career window, the masculists point the finger at women and tell them forcefully, quote, "Now that you women can work, you must work. Anything else is manslavery." Masculists are abolitionists, seeing fluffydom, in brackets, that is, the female expectation that men exist on this earth to pay for women to have babies. That is, fluffydom is the traditional expectation of women to be able to parasite off the money and labour of a man. Close brackets. So as manslavery, and see manslavery as slavery, and thus hate it. So masculists have a hatred of fluffy parasites and fluffy feminists for their hypocrisy in the divorce courts, etc. Masculists punish fluffy parasites and fluffy feminist hypocrites, in brackets, who want equal rights with men in the parliaments, but behave as fluffy parasites in the fluffy feminist-controlled divorce courts, financially massacring and destroying the lives of a quarter of married fathers, thus making themselves indirect genociders, since they have made divorce so toxic for men that in many countries now, 2/3 of young men reject marriage and paternity, so that these fluffy feminist hypocrites have become indirect genociders, to be wiped out, to be exterminated slowly by being totally ignored by men, so that fluffies are forced to rot on the shelf, so that their fluffy parasite genes are removed from the gene pool. Thus, from the above short masculist summary, one can see readily that the idea of fluffy manslavery features heavily in masculist ideas and masculist rhetoric. So if the government gives women the UBI, then women will become financially independent of men, no longer parasitic of men's money. So one would think, taking the wind out of the masculist sails, ? This might seem plausible at first sight, and it was my first reaction once I had thought up the question. But on further thought, I think the masculists will be far from having the wind blown out of their sails if the UBI comes. I think this for the following reasons. The first is timing. The government cannot afford to give massive UBI handouts to everyone, since if they do, there will be hefty inflation, so that the real purchasing power of people will lower, since the price of purchasable goods and services will rise, so that one's real purchasing power with each extra dollar will go down. So any initial UBI will have to be non-massive, so that the income of a middle-class professional who has studied and acquired a real skill that the economy values will have a purchasing power considerably higher than that of the person whose only income is the UBI. Hence fluffies, in brackets, that is traditional women who expect to be able to parasite off the money and labour of a man, close brackets, will still be looking to get their financial claws into some stupid, ignorant, gullible manslave, expecting him to pay for her to live in a middle-class house so that she can raise her kids in it and have him pay for it all. Thus the masculist push to create a FIPs society, in brackets, where all adults are FIPs, equals financially independent persons, will remain relevant and valid. In fact, you could argue, given that women are dumber than men on average by 4 IQ points and have a 10% lower IQ variance, in brackets, that is, women's IQ scores are more bunched up over a whole population and men's are more spread out, then the highest IQ people will be men. Thus more women will fall below the threshold IQ level to be employable than men. So an unemployed woman will be tempted to try to sexploit an employed man in order to raise her standard of living. Over several decades, as the machines become highly intelligent and incredibly productive, working at high speeds 24/7 with no fatigue, no rest breaks, day and night, then governments will be able to afford to offer its population UBIs with ever greater purchasing power. Once that happens, and that situation is still some decades off, then a higher proportion of the wind will be taken out of the masculist sails, since women will be able to live quite well on the UBI and not feel the need to sexploit men, the way they have for thousands of generations, even evolving to be prostitutes to men in order to be more able to bribe men with sex, to persuade men to give women men's scarce male-hunted meat that women needed to survive, but were unable to obtain for themselves, being stuck at home with helpless human infants. But not all of the masculist complaints about women are geared towards freeing men from manslavery at the hands of fluffy parasites. There are more psychological issues as well. For example, women very probably evolved to nag men in order to be able to extract more resources from men in the distant past. Masculism is an ideology for men that intellectually arms men with ideas and rhetoric that men can use to force women to grow up, to FIP up. In today's world, that's April 2021, nearly all women, if they are feminists, are monoconscious. That is, they have only had their feminist consciousness raised. That is, they have been taught by feminism that men oppress women, so they are angry at men for that. Since these monoconscious feminists know nothing about masculism, that is, about how women oppress men, and in reality far worse than men oppress women, brackets, for example, with women's financial parasitism, women's manslavery, women's fluffy feminist hypocrisy in the divorce courts, women's many decades-lasting gender crimes against men, for example, paternity fraud, pill lying, etc. They are angry at men, making themselves repulsive to men, since men refuse to have relationships with misandrist, male-dumping, feminazi bitches and punish them by ignoring them, not even pumping and dumping them, making these heterosexual, monoconscious feminists crazy. Men rape women, men sexually harass women, etc. So the feminists have a case against men. Masculists don't deny that. But a monoconscious feminist will not have a basis for comparison to compare how much men oppress women with how much women oppress men, because by definition, a monoconscious feminist knows nothing about how women oppress men. So as long as she remains monoconscious, she will probably remain what the masculists call an MFB, that's monoconscious feminazi bigot. That is, closed-minded towards the idea that women oppress men far worse than vice versa. So even in an era when the UBI payments are large, so that women can literally afford to be FIPs in practice, if they remain monoconscious, they are likely to remain being MFBs, and hence remain repulsive to men, who will punish them by forcing them to remain on the shelf, that is manless, hence loveless, sexless, babyless, and spat at by men, and especially by masculisted men. Thus, in summary, I see masculism maintaining its relevance to men, even when the UBI allows a woman to be quite wealthy, with a high standard of living and purchasing power. Women tend to blame others for their own inadequacies. That is, they blame mostly men, rather than being forced by men, by masculisted men, to grow up, to take responsibility for their own lives. Masculisted men will be intellectually armed with masculist ideas, masculist rhetoric, and will not tolerate MFB attitudes in women, so that when these masculisted men come across it, they will gender politically harangue such MFBs out of the room. Women will quickly adapt to being harangued by very angry masculists in their audiences and learn to become bi-conscious, or have their fucking heads bitten off by masculists who expect women, including feminists, to be bi-conscious rather than monoconscious feminazi bigots. Even in a UBI era, masculists will not tolerate monoconscious feminazi bitchery. Masculists will have the intellectual tools and the expectation to wipe out such monoconscious feminist ignorance. It's likely, therefore, that masculism is here to stay and will be only mildly influenced by the rise of UBI. Women may become FIPs, thanks to the UBI coming from the government. But they can still be monoconscious feminazi bitches and hence need to be masculisted or they'll rot on the shelf. I see masculism having a very long life expectancy. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man-Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 420 plus masculist flyers for men's studies courses, freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.